All right, y'all, let's go ahead and get started. Today's a little bit of a long lecture, so I want to make sure we have plenty of time to get through it. So we have the entirety of Monday to do our review. As always, we have our typical set of reminders. I did go through a little bit more detail with some of these on that announcement that I posted to web courses this morning. So the big thing that I want y'all to take away from all of that is if you have questions, don't be afraid to reach out, whether that be through email, set up a Zoom meeting with me, come to office hours, like we can set up a time that you can come talk with me in person, whatever works best for you. I'm happy to like just sit and chat about things just so I can make sure y'all are doing as best as you can in this class. That's kind of my ultimate priority is, you know, I'm not doing a good enough job as a teacher. All of y'all are failing this class, right? Now, of course, you know, you have quiz 10 due on Sunday, connecting with biology is due on Monday. If you have specific questions about connecting with biology, definitely just go ahead and email me. It's not too bad. Just keep in mind that, like, especially if you need accommodations for being able to move around, or if you're going to be gone away from campus, particularly those of you online, that's an option. You just need to reach out and let me approve it first before you just go out there and do stuff on your own. Keep in mind too that next Friday is the exam. Again, online and in person. Give me a heads up if you're going to take it in person. I have 200 copies of it, so it should be plenty enough, but I just want to make sure that if you want to take it in person, you don't have to wait on another test or some dumb thing like that. Again, review held on Monday. Make sure if you have questions and if you don't want to sell them in front of everybody, that's fine by me. Just shoot them to me ahead of time. And if you do, don't mind that, feel free to just come bring them and we can ask them during the actual class. And finally, extra credit for exam 3 is due on Friday as well. You are allowed to use the iNaturalist observations that you do for the connecting with biology assignment. And that's one of the reasons why I bumped up the requirements a little bit, since you're going to be doing this kind of stuff anyways. One thing to keep in mind though is if you do that, don't repost the same observation, just copy it in. That's fine too. You don't have to repost it twice. Does anybody have any questions or anything like that before we get started? Okay, perfect. So we're finally getting to our last real lecture before the test, and it's personally my favorite subjects are the animals, of course. I'm really kind of bummed because unfortunately I tried to get into the field building today and pull a bunch of specimens, but there was a class in there. So unfortunately I wasn't able to bring anything in. But I'll either try to do like a quick 10-minute vlog of an actual tour through that museum so you can see a bunch of different stuff, or I'll just try to bring it on another day. We'll see what I can figure out. So should be fun. Now, obviously, animals are extremely diverse. As you guys have been kind of getting a taste for it through the iNaturalist stuff, even just on campus, we have 200 to 300 different species of animals that are just roaming around, whether that be insects, other arthropods, birds, mammals, fish, amphibians, reptiles, all that different kind of stuff. Now, animals live almost everywhere, and there's over 1.3 million known animal species, with predominantly the majority of that being made up by insects. Because as we kind of talked about Wednesday, insects often have very close evolutionary relationships with plants. Now, obviously, animals vary greatly in size, habitat, body form, and intelligence. You know, there's just such a wide variety of different kinds of forms and functions that all exist in the animal kingdom. That's really fantastic. So what exactly is an animal? Because obviously, if we're going to start calling things animals, we should know explicitly what we're defining it as. So in this case, it's any organism that has these specific features in common. They're multicellular with eukaryotic cells that lack cell walls. That's what's going to separate them from things like plants or fungal organisms. They're heterotrophic, meaning they eat food by ingestion, although they're, and this doesn't necessarily mean that you don't get some weird things out there, like some of the tube worms that exist at the vents down in like the bottom of the Marianas Trench. Even those are still considered heterotrophic. They're also going to do something called the blastula stage of development. We'll talk about that a little bit more, what we mean by that here in a little bit. And finally, their cells produce an extracellular matrix to hold all those cells together and give them that multicellular approach to life. Now, unsurprisingly, just like everything else, and when it comes to like the origins of life, everything kind of originated in water of some sort. Probably the oceans, in this case, about 570 billion years ago. They probably resembled aquatic protists called choanoflagellates. And unsurprisingly, our most basal forms of life that we know of are things like sea sponges, which are very, very right on the edge of between what you would call a protist versus what you would call an animal. Now, unsurprisingly, early animals lived in the sea as well, because if you're starting there, you have a lot more opportunities to diversify. These echinoderms are what we call the earliest known fossil animals from the Precambrian era, and they died out somewhere around 544 million years ago and left no known modern ancestors, or descendants rather. Now, most living animals originated during this Cambrian period, including everything from sponges, jellyfish, arthropods, and mollusks, as well as the numerous different species of what we call worms, which one thing I want to clarify is worms aren't like a collective group. They're not all evolved at the same time. There's a bunch of things that we call worms that are kind of all on their own. Now, this animal diversity can be reflected based off of shared ancestors, kind of like what we've been talking about previously. So animals that share similarities because they evolved from the same common ancestors are going to have these specific features. And we have 9 major animal phyla that we're going to be talking about today that are grouped based off of these shared features of morphology, development, and DNA. The first thing we're going to talk about is animals are classified based off of if they have tissue or not. And as we talked about in that anatomy and physiology section, we know what tissue is and we know how to define it, relatively speaking. But there are organisms out there that are considered true animals that don't have a true tissue setup, where they just have a couple of very specialized cells that exist in throughout the entirety of their body. Now, this first branching point distinguishes animals from the true body tissue from animals with no true body tissue. Secondly, something that we can look at is they can be classified based on their body symmetry. Now, some organisms have no symmetry whatsoever, things like sponges that just kind of grow haphazardly and on their own. Whereas a lot of organisms have what we call either radial or bilateral symmetry. Radial means that basically it's kind of like if you could draw a circle and just draw lines from the center point out. At any point you draw it, more than likely that organism is exactly the same on the other side. Whereas bilateral symmetry, obviously, like humans and a bunch of other different organisms, if you draw a line right down the middle of us, it's going to be not exactly the correct and not exactly the exact same thing on either side, but it'll be pretty damn close. Now we're going to talk about some of the more non-specific ways that aren't necessarily readily apparent unless you're kind of like doing a dissection on an organism or something like that. And the first is animals that can be classified based off of their germ layer development. So in earlier development in animals, they undergo a process called gastrulation. And in some animals, the gastro only develops into 2 tissue layers called the endoderm and the ectoderm, the inside portion and the outside portion. Whereas in others, we have this third tissue layer that forms called the mesoderm. And with that mesoderm, you get the deriving of something called the coelom, which is basically an open body cavity, which is what we have. Secondly, you then have animals that are classified based off of mouth development. So obviously it can be really hard to see this if you're just looking at an animal in the field, but based off of long-standing taxonomy, we know this pretty well. They're either grouped onto 2 different groups, either protostomes or deuterostomes. Protostomes, top, right, are the ones that are going to be developing their digestive systems from the mouth, whereas deuterostomes are going to be the ones that develop it from their anus, or whatever term for the anus that they have for that specific organism. Additionally, animals can be classified based off of their body cavity. So as I mentioned, that you have that coelom, which is a body cavity that's surrounded on all sides by that mesoderm layer that we were talking about. And typically bilaterally symmetrical animals are going to have different types of coeloms. You could have a fluid of the coelom that's there to basically cushion the body organs, and it now enables them to shift as the animal bends and moves around. This is a hugely important development when it came to the development of organisms. Now keep in mind, you can kind of have a little bit of a gradient for this. So for instance, obviously most vertebrates have a true coelom, which has a well-defined endoderm or ectoderm. In something like a roundworm, they're going to have what we call a pseudocoelom, where they do have that interior portion, but they don't have the mesoderm that's actually forming it. It's kind of being formed on its own. And then finally, you have something like the flatworm, that's not gonna have a true sea level whatsoever. There's gonna be no extra body cavity inside of the animal. Animals can also be classified based off of how the structure and function of the digestive tract. Things like this hydra, which is kind of an earlier precursor to things like coral as well as jellyfish. These animals have an incomplete digestive tract, so if the mouth is both required to take in food and then eject food that's kind of been processed. Whereas obviously in humans and pretty much a lot of other life, we have what we call a unidirectional digestive system or a complete digestive system where food passes from one direction to the other and out a different orifice. Another way we can look at things is based off of how segmented they are. So some animal bodies are what we call segmented, where they have these very distinct little sections or annuli. And this segmentation adds to the body's flexibility, increased potential for development, as well as specialized body parts. You can see this in a lot of different forms because you can have segmentation in things like insects, where they're going to have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen where it's very well defined. Although obviously when you get to vertebrates, it doesn't always work out that way. Ultimately, probably something you may want to spend some time with before this exam is make sure you understand the general patterns in these 9 groups that we're going to talk about today. Which one has symmetry versus which one doesn't. Cephalization, in other words, do they have a head or not? Whether or not they have a true coelom, their digestive system, and their segmentation. So let's actually start digging into all these specific groups now that we've kind of introduced how we classify them, so we can start talking about things that are kind of important. Now, this first group that we're going to talk about is the sponges, which are those like very basal versions of animals. They don't have true tissue. They're kind of just grown haphazardly on their own, so they don't really have symmetry as well. Sponges are aquatic and sessile, and they're anchored to a surface. They do not have that true tissue. Basically, it's all these various highly specialized cells that exist kind of ubiquitously across the body. There's no like cell type A and B forming together to form a true tissue type. They also have hollow bodies that allow them to be either basically kind of allow water to move in and out of them. And usually just because of the way that they're structured based on how they grow, they're going to be asymmetrical or potentially radially symmetrical. But that's not always the case. How many of y'all actually knew that sponges were animals? Just out of, okay. It's okay if you didn't know. That's actually really interesting because I like to point this out that, yeah, the same crappy like things that you buy down at the sponge docks in Tarpon Springs, those were real animals. It's not like it's a plant or something like that growing on the bottom of the ocean. They have very specialized cells and are considered true animals. Now, ultimately, what happens in sponges is they're going to filter, they're classic filter feeders. So water is going to move into the body through the pores in the side and then out through the hole at the top. So this kind of creates a nice kind of classic, basically it creates water movement that goes in from the side. And this allows sponges to trap food and eliminate waste. And so within the sponge, you have this water inflow section. You have these collar cells, which are going to be there to actually collect the food, which have these flagellum on the outside of them and are going to generate that water pressure and move the water through the animal. Then finally get these amoebocytes and the spicules. The amoebocytes are actual, just kind of made up of this, are going to be there primarily for structuring the animal. And then the spicules are the actual non-cellular components that are holding the thing together. Now, reproduction in sponges are kind of interesting because they're true hermaphrodites, so they don't really have a sex per se. And as such, their reproduction is typically by a budding. And so when they do reproduce sexually, the same organism can release both sperm into the water and release eggs into the water, and those fertilized eggs are retained within the body of the sponge itself. And so that way they can grow and develop on their own. Now, this next group are called Nidarians. They're the simplest animals with true tissues. And they're kind of things like jellyfish, coral, hydras. They're kind of interesting. There's a lot of weird little subgroups within it. If you've ever heard of something called the sea walnut, which is about yay big, you've probably seen one before, even if you don't know what it is. It's the jellyfish looking thing that have like the 4 lines that come down that like radiate the colors of the rainbow as they move down. They're really popular in aquariums. They're hard to miss. Cnidarians are aquatic, both freshwater and saltwater, and are radially symmetrical. And they have specialized cells that they use to sting other animals. So how many of y'all are familiar with things like fire coral? Yeah. So fire coral, because it's derived from the same group, it makes sense why it's also venomous as well. And so it has a very similar reaction to if you've gotten stung like a jellyfish, it's because they're all related. Cnidarian, the name actually comes from the actual Greek story of Medusa and kind of how all that breaks down, but it's really cool. And primarily there's 4 main groups of cnidarians where you have jellyfish, hydra, coral, and sea anemones. Now, cnidarians have an incomplete digestive tract with 2 different tissue layers. On one end of the body, it has an opening that we consider what we call the mouth, which is surrounded by a ring of tentacles. And the cnidarians are going to transition between a sessile and a polyp form. In other words, they're going to have a form where they're just attached to a rock or something like that and grow for a while, versus a sessile or a polyp form where they're going to be out swimming around. Now, coral cnidarians are the basis for a crucial number of ocean ecosystems, unsurprisingly so. One of the largest the largest coral reef in existence is the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia. It is a huge tourist spot and obviously brings in a lot of money for Australia, but it houses some of the most incredible fish diversity, incredible other invertebrate diversity. It's one of the main reasons why that area around the Golden Coast is so well productive when it comes to animals and plants. Now, these corals do this by secreting a calcium carbonate exoskeleton that allows them to accumulate and build up these magnificent coral reefs, which are home to obviously a wide variety of different animals for sure. And these coral reefs help to protect coastlines from erosion. However, something to keep in mind with this is that calcium carbonate plays a very crucial role in the carbon cycle of the Earth, right? So one of the things that's becoming a problem is coral acidification. Basically what happens is because of the excess amount of CO2 in the environment, it increases the amount of carbonic acid in the oceans. And as a result, that carbonic acid starts breaking down this calcium carbonate. And thus, coral aren't really able to grow and reproduce as they properly should. But this is highly variable, so it's kind of hard to keep track of exactly how much particular areas are being affected. But I don't know if you've been diving in Florida recently, but the last 10 years or so, it looks completely different than how it did in the early 2000s. Finally, we're going to start getting into our more basic protostomes, where you're going to have a true mouth through an anus digestive system. The flatworms are very simple protostomes. These are typically what we call platy helminths, or the actual scientific term for it. Platy, flat, helminths, the worm, pretty straightforward. They're bilaterally symmetrical with 3 germ layers, but again, they don't have a true coelom here, or even a pseudocoelom. So these are going to include things like planarians, flukes, tapeworms, and the 3 different are your kind of main categories of flatworms. And while flatworms can be primarily can live on their own, a lot of them are associated with being parasitic and have incredibly very diverse lifestyles where they have like 3 or 4 different hosts that they all have to hit exactly at specific times. They're pretty nasty stuff. They're very well designed for reproduction and they do very well for themselves, but you don't want to mess with these too much. Now that flatworm body shape is going to help increase their surface area. It allows them for efficient gas exchange in the absence of that coelom, like we mentioned, and thus allow for specialized respiratory or circulatory system. Now, planarians are free-living flatworms. They're going to have a feeding structure called the pharynx. It's going to bring food into the body and excrete undigested food, as well as they're going to have a brain and a nerve core that makes up their nervous system, so they can sense everything from touch, chemicals, and light. Oftentimes, in very early intro bio courses, you'll get to interact with these because they don't sense true pain, but they do sense disturbances. And so you can actually interact with them, kind of poke and prod them a little bit and see how they respond to things like light, touch, that sort of thing. Now, kind of moving on to our next big major group, are the mollusks. Now, mollusks are soft, unsegmented protostomes. They do have their extremely diverse phylum with a true coelom, and mollusks feature something called a mantle that secretes the actual construction of their cell. Now, even in mollusks that seemingly have lost their shell, they still have the capacity for producing the same chemicals that make up what would have been in the mantle. For instance, if you've ever seen like a squid or an octopus where they have that big hard beak, that's where it's being coming from. It's the same kind of general evolutionary process that a thing like a snail would use to build its shell. They also have something called a muscular foot for locomotion, so that way they can actually move around. Some of these are incredibly well developed, things like obviously octopi, versus others not being as interesting. Then they're going to have what we call the visceral mass, which is kind of where their central organs are going to be. That's usually part of their coelom. And finally, they have something called the radula, which is basically a modified tongue that's there for either scraping things or helping to break things down. So there's 4 primary groups that we're going to mention here. And you have things like chitons, which are 8 overlapping shell segments. They usually just kind of glue themselves up to a rock and kind of scrape off all the periphyton and all the stuff that grows on rocks. You're going to have the bivalves, which are your classic hinge shell organisms. Basically, anything that you're going to go walking down the beach and pick up is probably a bivalve. Gastropods, which have a spiral-shaped shell. These are all those cute little Cuban brown snails that you guys have been finding all over campus. And finally, of course, probably the most interesting group, the most intelligent of this group, the cephalopods, which have internal or absent shells. Those are going to be your squids and your octopi. Now, these mollusks have multiple organ systems where you have this big visceral mass that's going to house those organs together. And that's going to make up your respiratory, excretory, nervous, reproductive, and circulatory systems all in that kind of same isolated spot. So one more group of worms that we do have to talk about, unfortunately, are the annelids or segmented worms. Now, annelids are characterized by having true body segments, a true coelom, and a complete digestive tract. Earthworms and leeches are the terrestrial classic versions of these, although there are things like polychaetes that live in water that are really, really cool looking if you look up some of these animals. Some of the segmented worms that exist in the bottoms of the ocean, particularly around coral reefs, are bright blue and venomous and really cool looking. So they're not just your same boring earthworms. Now, many ecosystems depend on earthworms, but I do want to put a caveat to this, that they can also be very destructive where they're not supposed to be. In fact, there's a very interesting paper that came out of a lab that I worked at Georgia, where they found that the biomass of the invasive European earthworms, which we often don't think of earthworms as invasive, right? Because there's obviously a bunch of different forms of it. It's hard to tell species 1 from species 2. But when they took over and they eat all of that soil and leaf litter, it basically causes a dramatic decline in all the native salamander populations in those areas. So they're not totally the best thing in the world. It just kind of depends on the context, like everything else. Now, where they're supposed to be, they help aerate and fertilize the soil, and they're more complex than they look and have a number of very strong, well-developed organ systems. For instance, they have a complete digestive tract, a closed circulatory system with aortic arches, so kind of a precursor to a heart. They have a nervous system that includes brain and ventral nerve cords, excretory system organs in which the body can each segment so they can get rid of things, and finally a saddle-like thickening area that holds eggs in a specialized cocoon. Now, one group is very closely related to them, but are slightly different, are the nematodes, or the unsegmented worms. You also might hear them called roundworms. Although these roundworms look worm-like, their closest evolutionary relationship is actually with arthropods, so things like bugs, spiders, millipedes, that sort of thing. And most roundworms are microscopic, and they're extremely abundant in almost every habitat. Now, one thing to keep in mind is, again, like our flatworms, they're often extremely parasitic as well. You've probably had to deal with these at some way, shape, or form when dealing with a pet. For instance, if you have a dog, you probably give them a monthly heartworm medication. That's to prevent these guys from showing up in the heart and killing them. Now, nematodes do have a few organ systems that are not as specialized as the segmented worms like we mentioned earlier. They have a nervous system that includes a brain and a nerve cord, but they do lack specialized circulatory and respiratory systems that you see in those other ones. And unlike a segmented worm, they don't have a true coelom. They have a pseudocoelom that acts kind of as a hydrostatic skeleton to keep them relatively supported, but without having that true body cavity to support all of their tissue. Finally, we get to things called the arthropods. This is an incredibly diverse group. It's the largest phylum of anything. And the big thing that you're going to need to keep in mind with these is that they have jointed appendages. That's what kind of defines them as a distinct organismal class. So arthro means joint, pod, feet, so jointed feet. But all their general things are going to have this, everything from their legs, their antennae, their mouth parts, as well as a lot of their organs are jointed together. Now, there are a number of groups that have died out as a result of just extinction. So things like trilobites were originally included in this group, but you also have myriapods, which are things like millipedes, which I'm sure some of you guys have seen around campus, as well as crustaceans and insects. Ultimately, over 1 million of that 1.6 million, or 1.8 million, whatever it was, species of arthropods exist. So if you think about it, over half of the known species of life on Earth when it comes to animals come from just this group alone. And again, that's often related to these very hyper-specialized niches that they can form because they're extremely small, and they often can hyper-specialize in one specific plant type or something like that. Now, arthropods have what we call an exoskeleton, and all arthropods produce this tough outer exoskeleton made up of what we call chitin, which is very similar to the material that you see in fungi. And as their bodies grow, they have to molt, which means that they have to basically break their bond with the original exoskeleton and build a new one underneath it. So oftentimes when these animals molt, they're much more vulnerable to attack and that sort of thing. This is especially true if you've ever seen large like tarantulas. They have to do this about every other month or so, depending on how often they're eating. And as a result, they have like a week time span where basically they're so soft and brittle that they kind of fall apart if you touch them. Now, arthropods have pretty complex body types, where they're going to be segmented into 3 major regions. You have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. Segments in each of these regions develop very specialized functions, unsurprisingly. That's kind of why they're probably divided into those regions in the first place. Now, arthropod bodies are segmented into these 3 classic regions you've probably heard of before: the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. However, some may just have a cephalothorax where they include the head and the thorax together. The segments in each of these regions help to develop those specialized functions. Now, clearly, as we were mentioning, arthropods are the most diverse group of life on Earth, or at least when it comes to animals. Arthropods are divided into 5 subphyla, with one group making up of the extinct trilobites that were completely lost. So it's these guys over here. And then you have things like spiders and scorpions and other chelicerates that have claw-like mouth parts called chelicerae. So that'll include your, your classic scorpions, spiders, ticks, horseshoe crabs. Then you have probably the most diverse group of any of the arthropods, the insects, which again, this is that highly successful group where they're super small, they have very specialized niches where they're going to live in the environment. Most insects are terrestrial, while some live in reproducing fresh water, and some even live in our skin, where you have like these little skin mites that are probably crawling around you right now and you don't even know it. But as a result, you often have a lot of microscopic animals as well that are kind of a part of this group. So moving out of arthropods into our next big group, and these, so despite their look, are probably the most closely related organisms to chordates, or what eventually became vertebrates, so things like us, birds, mammals. These are called the echinoderms. They're most closely related to the chordates, and this group includes things like sea urchins, sea stars, and sea cucumbers. They're going to have what we call pentaradial symmetry, which basically means that more often than not, their body can be divided into 5 distinct sections that are all uniquely identical. Classic examples of these include things like sand dollars, which I'm sure many of you found out on the beach, sea stars, sea urchins, and sea cucumbers. And now they're unusual among animals in that as they're adults, they're radially symmetrical, but when they're larvae, they have a bilateral symmetry. So that's what's kind of tricky, and one of the reasons why we didn't necessarily think that they were very closely related to chordates. Now, these echinoderms have what we call this tube feet that basically have a specialized hydrostatic system where they use water to basically move themselves around. And this allows them to carry out functions of complex circuitry, circulatory system, respiratory system, and the excretory system all at once. These 2 feet will pump out water and act as locomotion as well, and sensory systems. They're really fascinating. If you ever watch a sea star move, if you ever go to a aquarium and watch one, you'll notice that they have all these like little moving things on the underside of their arms as they move around. That's these 2 feet that you're seeing. Now, finally, now that we've kind of introduced all the other stuff, kind of explained their evolutionary relationship, we can dig into probably, I would argue, is the most important vertebrate group or most important animal group. Some would argue against us, but to be honest, what group has one species that completely shaped the entirety of what the world looks like by itself? So that's obviously the chordates. So chordates are an incredibly diverse group as well. Obviously not as diverse as something like an arthropod, but they have about 60,000 different species, with about 30,000 of those being birds, and include everything from humans, mammals, fish, and some really odd little one-off things. Now, all chordates share 4 of the same features. They're going to express these 4 features at some point during their life, so they may be lost at some point as they become adults. And that's how we can tell that they've all been inherited from that same common ancestor. We know that they exist at some point, even if they don't necessarily keep them. It's kind of like how dolphins have hairs when they're first born and then initially lose it. They're still mammals, they still had hair at some point, but they've lost it now as they become adults. Now, some chordates are considered invertebrates because they don't have a true notochord. They don't have a spinal column like we associate with other organisms that are considered vertebrates. These include things like tunicates, lancelets, and hagfish. So even though a hagfish is called a fish, it's not a true vertebrate because it doesn't have that true notochord, that true development of a true spinal cord that you'll see in vertebrates. Again, like I kind of been alluding to here, vertebrates are going to be anything that is defined as having that protected spinal column. So vertebrates are going to have a series of vertebrae that are small structures that make up the backbone itself, and that can be used to be made out of both bone or cartilage. So there are a number of organisms that just stick with cartilage for a long time for this, but they still have that protection to not have their notochord get damaged. So specifically, I do want to point that out because obviously you have things like cartilaginous fish, like sharks and rays, that even though it's not a true backbone like we would associate with most vertebrates, it's still a vertebrate animal. Additionally, things like tadpoles will often not have true bones when they're first developing. They'll have that more the cartilage-based protection until they become adult frogs, which is why it's really hard to find a tadpole that has like an actual bone structure. You can't exactly get it to preserve very easily. Now, some chordates have jaws, but not all of them do. Obviously, things like fish, amphibians, and reptiles and mammals all have that hinged jaw that frame the mouth entrance, but this isn't always the case. Things like lampreys, which still have a vertebra, but don't have a true mouth. It's basically just a gaping hole that, even though they have teeth, it's really funky. Basically, how they feed is they have to attach themselves to things and basically just tear apart the organism. So this has become an issue in particular places, unsurprisingly so. For instance, they used to do triathlons in parts of the Great Lakes. They're not able to do those as much anymore because during a couple of the events, they had invasive lamprey get into the Great Lakes about 50 years ago, and they started to take, some of them have developed a taste for humans. And so these swimmers would be getting out in big circles about that big around on their calves and whatnot, where the lamprey had attached itself, used the teeth to rip a hole, and then sucks up what's left of the skin that's been pulled away. Really fascinating, kind of terrifying. Definitely the perfect thing to talk about right before Halloween. Now, some chordates are what we call tetrapods. Unsurprisingly, tetrapod just means that they have 4 limbs, right? So fish, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals all have these hinged jaws that frame that entrance to the mouth, as well as they have, but the thing that kind of separates the fish from all of these other groups is that development of those 4 independent limbs that are going to link into that spinal structure, link into what kind of skeleton? See if y'all remember this. Axial. Appendicular versus axial, right? Where one of them is that center point that runs all the way down your body, the other one are like your lips. Yeah, technically I can see where I screwed up and gave you a little bit of a confusing question. My bad. Don't worry about that being on the test. Now, what's really interesting is some of these chordates have evolved something called an amnion. Now, an amnion is a specialized reproductive structure that allows these organisms to get away from the water and not have to use water to lay their eggs in, so they don't have to dry out. Now, reptiles and mammals have these several membranes that surround and protect and feed the developing young. Again, this includes birds, when you're talking about reptiles. But basically, you have amniota, which is kind of the basal form, where at some point you had some sort of organism that existed prior to mammals and reptiles, and then reptiles with one way and mammals with the other. These amniotic eggs allow those organisms to survive on land when they're laying those eggs. So this reflects that shared ancestry of reptiles and mammals. These shelled eggs contain membranes that cushion the embryo and allow for gas exchange. And you have a yolk that's going to feed the embryo. Now, one thing to keep in mind is not all of them have that like very hard outer layer like you think of as a chicken egg. A lot of crocodilians, turtles, and lizards will have a soft, leathery one. And obviously, when you're talking about organisms that have internal births and all that kind of fun stuff, all of that stuff has basically lost that outer protective casing and it's just held within the body at that point. And you see that in both mammals as well as often a lot of reptiles that will have either ovoviviparous reproduction, which means that they basically have little miniature eggs without the protective layer inside of themselves at one point, and they'll have live birth that way, or they'll have a true oviparous live birth, kind of like humans. Now, kind of jumping back, those tunicates and lancelets are those invertebrate chordates. They're extremely basic, and they're often primarily found in marine environments. However, they do have a cranium and vertebra, so they're still considered a vertebrate. Or sorry, they're still considered chordate. It's just not as developed as well. Now, one thing to keep in mind too is, especially with tunicates, their adult form is going to look nothing like their larval form, which is what's actually showing those relationships. Then you're going to get to these external groups that are just right on the outside of fish, or technically cartilaginous fish, where you have the hagfish and the lampreys that have no jaws. Lampreys are going to have that cartilage around the nerve cord, and they're going to be the first animal that evolved a true vertebra or vertebra system, whatever you want to call it. And the hagfish that are going to be there are kind of funky. They don't have a true spinal cord, and that allows them to do some very interesting things. They can actually tie themselves up into knots, which is kind of cool. But what's really interesting about this is they're probably the most famous for having this slime, but some of the worst substance to get out of anything in the planet. It just coats everything and it just goops up everything, so you can't actually physically handle them for more than about 2 seconds. And that allows them, through the process of basically forming those knots over and over, to slide out of your hand and get away from you. Kind of a neat trick, but it's definitely really nasty to deal with. Then you get to those classic examples of fish, which are both cartilaginous or bony. These are going to have jaws, gills, haired fins, and a sense organ called a lateral line used for detecting vibrations. So instead of having like a bunch of little nerve sensing things all the way across their body, they primarily focus it on that lateral line. So it can help them sense water pressure, depth, all that kind of fun stuff. Now, again, like we mentioned, fish have either cartilaginous or bone skeletons. These fish are the most diverse group and abundant group of vertebrates. They're the most ancient, have cartilaginous skeletons, things like sharks and rays, as well as things like ratfish. Whereas you have bony fish, which are generally defined into 2 groups, the ray-finned and the lobe-finned fish. Now, lobe-finned fish are going to eventually give rise to your tetrapods, just for context. But ray-finned are basically going to just have a lot of like independently attached little bone structures that are kind of radiating out from a central point. They're not going to have like support from the rest of the body. It's like if you had a hand without an arm, or at least a functional arm. Now, obviously, in order for you to have those developments into a tetrapod where you've got 4 limbs and can start moving around on land, there's kind of this transitionary step in the lobed fin fishes where you have limbs that are rows in this group that are helpful for like supporting them as they walk around on the bottom of the ocean, that sort of thing. And fish in this group have lungs that often can breathe air, as well as gills when, so that way when water is scarce, they can just kind of like exist out of water for a little bit. They also have extremely robust pectoral fins, allowing them to move on the land itself. And these features are those precursors for that modern tetrapod lungs and legs that we've talked about. Great examples of these lobe-finned fishes include things like the lungfish or the coelacanth. They have these like early developments that almost look like limbs. They're kind of like an intermediary step. And finally, that brings us to my personal favorite group. That's the amphibians, which the name means double life or two lives. Amphibians are tetrapods that began the colonization of land around 375 million years ago, which for context, remember, there's like 200 million years between the first animals just showing up somewhere to things that are now living on land that have highly specialized legs. It's incredible how quick this evolution can occur, but also how slow it can occur at the same time. Now they breathe air using lungs or use their skin or gills. It's kind of a mixed bag for all three. And they do need water for reproduction and to keep their skin moist. Now there's three primary groups of amphibians. You have the frogs, which, I mean, y'all are adults, y'all been around this earth long enough to kind of know what a frog looks like by now. Things like salamanders, which are lizard-like, but again, they're still amphibians. They have that really moist skin. You can't really physically handle them that much, or they're gonna have issues from like the oils on your skin, that kind of thing. And then you have caecilians, which are an amphibian that are very odd. Definitely Google search these. Some of them look rather phallic, unfortunately, but they're very weirdly specialized lifestyles for both aquatic and terrestrial animals. They're highly fossorial, so when they are on the earth, you're probably never going to see them except for when they burrow out. And they often have live young, which is even more interesting. Now, from these amphibians, that's where you're going to see the rise of the reptiles from that group. So reptiles are the first vertebrates to thrive on land, and they evolved about 310 million years ago. So less than like 20 million years after the arrival of amphibians, you have this reptile group showing up. Now, reptiles are adapted to retain water on the inside of their body as well as to reproduce outside of it. So they have these hard keratinized scales that keep the water inside, as well as they've developed that amniotic egg to help protect their eggs from drying out and dying that way. Now, reptiles live and reproduce primarily on dry land. Of course, there are obviously a lot of organisms that do not, that are also reptiles, things like snakes, some of the aquatic reptiles from like the Cretaceous period, things like Liopleurodon, all that stuff are still considered reptiles, even though they primarily live in the water. But they do have, all of them still have those specialized land adaptations that include things like the reduced water loss from the skin due to scales, as well as internalized fertilization and those amniotic eggs to make reproduction independent of water. Now, there's 5 kind of major groups that are still around today: birds, aka dinosaurs, alligators, turtles, snakes, and lizards. Snakes and lizards are the most closely related group. In fact, snakes derived from lizards originally. Turtles and alligators are separated. Alligators are probably the most closely related to the birds and the dinosaurs, whereas turtles are kind of like right at the basal lineage of all these reptiles and are right before, like probably came right after reptiles split from what became mammals.
What makes birds reptiles and not mammals?
So we'll talk about that here in a second, but the big difference is that birds have scales, right? They have shelled eggs, right? And a lot of this is down to evolutionary relationships. They have very similar structures to the dinosaurs, and dinosaurs are clearly reptiles based off of their evolutionary relationships. And feathers, for context, are just a modified scale. And so if you ever, especially notice this while you're out walking around doing your iNaturalist stuff, look at the legs of something like a great egret or something like that. Notice how they're all black and scaly looking and kind of mean looking. You can tell pretty quickly that they have that reptilian origin. Again, like I mentioned, there's these 5 lineages of reptiles. Birds and dinosaurs are grouped together. Then you have crocodiles, which are closely related to that group, in a group called archosaurs. And then you have the non-avian reptiles, which include lizards and snakes, and then tortoises and turtles. Now, like I mentioned, birds are just simply feathered reptiles adapted for flight. Birds have a unique set of features that set them apart from other reptiles that allow them to fly, things like feathers, wings, lightweight hollow bones. They have a very powerful heart, which if you think about it, remember back to when we were talking about the structures of the heart and how many have 4 chambers versus 3 chambers and all that kind of stuff. Crocodilians and birds have 4 chambers. It's kind of one of the things that'll set them apart. They also have power, they're also endothermic, which, keep in mind, a lot of dinosaurs are probably endothermic too. Things like T-Rex was warm-blooded. It's kind of scary to think about if you think about it. A 40-foot tall or a 40-foot long, 12-foot tall, warm-blooded predator that's looking for food. They can run about 20 miles an hour. Now, mammals kind of diverged right before what we consider true reptiles today diverged off into their own pathway. They evolved about 200 million years ago, and they are endothermic amniotes with milk-secreting mammary glands, and they also produce things like hair and help that which are there to kind of help preserve body heat. So obviously, if you're going to use all that energy to produce your own internal body heat, you should probably do something to kind of protect it a little bit. Now, mammals as a group are grouped based off of their reproductive strategy. So you have things like monotremes, which are going to lay eggs. That's going to include things like your echidna or your platypus, which, out of curiosity, how many of y'all know that platypus are actually venomous? Yeah, that's something, again, it makes sense if you think about it, because they're these very basal mammals that still have those like weird traits that kind of get lost when you become more specialized later on in life, or later on in evolution, rather. Then you have things like marsupials, which are going to have these pouches to develop babies for a number of months, because they don't have that true placenta that's going to allow them to have that sustained sustenance through the entirety of their reproductive period. And then finally, you get to placental mammals, like pretty much everything that you associate as a mammal, which are going to have that connected placenta to the mother's uterus and share her circulatory system. So it's an absolutely fascinating group of organisms where you have all these different species. Definitely take the time to kind of get to know these. It'll be helpful, especially because when I talk about the iNaturalist assignment, you'll want to kind of basically group these based off of these groups. Does that make sense? Now, how do we know all these things are related, right? Obviously, we have fossils and DNA to help tell these stories. But even specifically in humans, it's really important to kind of understand this, because humans are a very uniquely derived group, and there's no other organism quite like us. Again, like I mentioned, that humans are placental mammals and are in a group called primates, which include any organism that has grasping hands or opposable thumbs, a flat nail instead of claws, eyes that are forward set in the front of the skull with binocular vision, and a brain that's relatively large compared to the body size. Now, primates are divided into three main lineages. You have the prosimians, which are things like lemurs, your classic New World and Old World monkeys, and then finally the hominoids, that's probably better way to put it, which are the great apes, as well as usually it includes things like gibbons and a couple other stuff right on the outside. Now, humans are a type of great ape, which we're mostly related to chimpanzees, but obviously it's not like it's more like cousins than a sibling sort of thing. Where you have within that lineage of hominids, that human group is called the hominins, and those modern humans are the only hominid species that's not extinct. Now, skeletal evidence reveals common ancestry. So it's pretty easy to see how something like a human and a chimpanzee can have very similar things, or very similar evolutionary development. One thing I do want to point out, though, that the main difference here is locomotion that's causing that shift in body posture. Whereas at some point you had the development of Australopithecus about 3 million years ago, which is present in Kenya, Tanzania, that sort of area. That was the first primate to stand upright like we do nowadays, in a term that we call bipedal. You can also look at skulls and teeth to see how these have these very similar relationships. And I believe we showed you a picture of evolutionary, when you look at the skull of a baby versus the skull of a baby chimp, they're very, very similar. And some of these differences that you do see in the adult animals or adult humans are just as a result of specialized diets and that sort of thing that happen after they become, an adult. Additionally, you can look at the molecular chemistry of things. We talked about how you can use DNA to kind of differentiate different groups, right? You can also see which groups are most closely related as well, based off of how different they are from something else. So studies of blood proteins and DNA make it very clear that humans are technically a species of great ape. And in fact, DNA sequences of humans and chimpanzees are nearly identical. About 99% difference. That 1% difference in a 2 billion base pair organism is pretty substantial, for sure, but it's still different. So you have all these different relationships with all these different groups. You can see things like once you get to Homo erectus, you start having its own little breakoff points where you start seeing Heidelbergensis, Neanderthalensis, Florensis. All of these Homo species existed up until about 10 to 15,000 years ago. So it's human or Homo sapiens have only been the dominant human species for about the last 10 to 15,000 years. So what exactly happened to these groups? Well, we're not entirely certain how they went extinct, but there's a couple different hypotheses. It could just be the result of climate change, particularly at the end of the ice ages, that could have done some of these groups in, as well as we've seen where, particularly with Neanderthals and Florensis, they have genetics that have kind of incorporated themselves into human genomes, so they may have had some interbreeding events as well, and kind of been hybridized out of existence. Now, once you get past that and look at modern humans, things like migration and culture have been greatly changed because based off of isolation over time. So one thing I do want to point out here is that humans don't have any subspecies or anything like that. Even if you just look at basic race level differences, those aren't real. A lot of these same traits that you find in that provide dark skin in African Americans are found just about everywhere else in the world, and it's all just kind of like the alleles that are present at specific times. So I do want to make that very clear that there's no really strong genetic differences between humans when you're talking about Homo sapiens. All right. So sorry I ran a little bit long today, but just remember all these things are coming up. It's also on that announcement that's on WebCourses.